It's great to be here. I hope everyone's having a terrific day and a good lunch. And so yeah, we're here to talk about the anatomy of a deal, to put a little framework to this. Last year, Ramin ran a session which we called Accelerating into Growth, and basically what do you do after the capital raise. One of the observations that I've made here, which is actually very positive to me, is that obviously there's a lot of companies here that are raising capital. I've met more companies this year that they're not raising capital, but they're very much thinking about deals, and the anatomy of a successful deal is what we're here to talk about today. We're gonna pick one apart. We're gonna talk about the things we learned, the things that we may think about in the future. But before we get started, I thought we'd do some quick intros. We'll start at Chris's side and work our way back. Quick intro, and then we'll jump into it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Chris Eso. I lead business development and strategy for Medtronic for our cardiovascular portfolio. Been with Medtronic for about 12 years, all on the cardiovascular side, M&A and business development activities. Born and raised in Orange County.
Hi, everyone. Andrew Albardisi. I'm a partner at Deerfield. Focus on healthcare technology and also biotech, and really anything that's technology related in the healthcare space. Deerfield's a healthcare-only investment firm. We manage around $16 billion. 2/3 of our assets are on the private side. We also have a public fund, and so have the ability to fund companies from inception throughout their life cycle. Nice to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sabing Lee. I'm a partner at Kenobi Martins, so we're an IP firm up the road in Irvine. I'm a med tech attorney. I've been working with CathWorks for a few years, so we're the main patent counsel, IP counsel for CathWorks. Worked with Andrew before at Deerfield, so happy to be here and talk about our involvement with this deal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ramin Musawi. I lead the team at CathWorks. We are actually housed out of Irvine, so very local, and I am told that we are the first LSI alum, so we were the very first company that signed up for the very first LSI, so it's great to come full circle.
That's right, and I'll share a brief story. Some of you have heard this, but that is true. That's a true story. 4.5 years ago, I called Ramin, said, "Hey, Ramin, we're thinking of doing something different. This is where we're going with it. I know you're at CathWorks. He interrupted me. He said, "I'm in, Scott. I'm going to do it." And so we're actually super proud that 4.5 years ago, it starts with a conversation. We go through our ups and downs, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in this panel, but here we are today to talk about the success of a deal that actually happened. That makes us very proud, and congratulations. Let's start with kind of setting the framework here and define what a successful deal is. Obviously, it's one that happens, but Chris and Andrew, maybe you can talk about key ingredients for a successful deal from the outset that are there or maybe aren't there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of aspects to a successful deal, right? But I think it starts with trust. It has to have strategic alignment for the strategic and what they're looking for. It needs to meet, obviously, financial expectations that we have, but also what is the right situation and exit for both the shareholders and the investors. And ultimately, at the end of the day, both parties have to give a little, right? And there's never going to be a one-sided transaction. And so you have to be able to give and take a little bit and feel a little pain and give a little pain in order to get to a successful deal. Ultimately, obviously, it's about patient care and making sure that we can bring this technology to a larger patient population.
Yeah, my answer is pretty simple. I mean, if you're a board member, your fiduciary obligation is to maximize value to all shareholders. That sounds very simple. It's actually very complicated because a successful deal in the moment is balanced against what could be future potential upside offset by the incremental dilution that one would take. And that's a very complicated thing when you're looking at a very promising technology and you see huge potential. But one of the things that I think is critical to a successful deal, particularly when you're transacting with a party, is, as Chris said, trust in the counterparty. Because many of these deals will have obviously an upfront consideration, but there will also be value-creating events that hopefully the existing shareholders can share in down the line. And to the extent that you have the confidence in that partner to maximize the value of those earnouts or the value that's received by shareholders, that's a critically important piece. And we'll talk about how that evolved in this particular case, I'm sure.
And maybe, Scott, if I add just, I'm assuming most people know, but just to frame the deal that we've done, so we announced last year in July that we entered into a strategic agreement with Medtronic. What we publicly shared is this has multiple elements, starting with an acquisition option agreement for up to $585 million publicly disclosed amount, and Medtronic investing $75 million into CathWorks. We are working together to actually, if that time, co-promote this in US, Europe, and Japan. And then there are a bunch of other elements that we didn't share globally. So as far as the complex deals goes, this one is pretty complex, So the elements of what's being touched all had to come together for that to happen.
Right. And I guess one of the questions I have for Andrew is, you were promised great weather on the way out here and a bunch of free time. And looking at your sheet there, I don't know if, well, we know the weather was no good, but I don't know if you had much free time. Will you do another deal with Ramin after he put you through this?
Will I do another deal with Ramin? Why wouldn't I not do another deal with Ramin? No, Ramin, most of you don't know me, but I often don't have glowing things to say about many people, but Ramin is by far one of the best CEOs I've ever had. Just absolutely phenomenal in terms of executing. Whatever Ramin does next, he's got my support.
I'm sure that was going to be the answer. Okay, so this was a complex deal. Okay, what are some learnings that came out of this deal that may translate into other deals that are happening, and/or will we see similar deals like this? And maybe we can start with Ramin, and then we can work down the line here.
Yeah, I think, for me, as we look back, I'm obviously the beneficiary of a great team that we have at CathWorks. So, but one of the things that we learned out of this one is to take the input that you get. We've been lucky to have multiple strategics as investors, but taking the feedback that you get from your strategic investors very seriously, and I'll let Chris give a little more insight into that, but everybody that launches a product in the beginning is excited, but I don't know that many products that at the launch they are ready. And the question is, are you ready to get the feedback and react to it, or you want to be stubborn and assume that you know better than anybody else? So for me, the biggest takeaway is that if you get a feedback on the product, react to it properly and then see if it works out or not. And I think that and the trust thing, which I'm sure we're going to come back to, is what it takes to do deals more like that. But you usually don't get both of them at the same time.
Yeah, I can add to that. If you think about this transaction, right, it started, 5-6 years ago. And we did diligence. We gave feedback, like Ramin was saying, on specific things that we weren't happy with, that we wanted to see them improve upon. And to their credit, CathWorks' credit, they actually went and did work on those four. There were 4 things specifically that we highlighted, and they worked through those. And then they came back to us and said, okay, we've done this, this, and this. Is this acceptable? And we said, well, we changed our mind. We want this over here. No, we didn't. We said, though, that there were certain things that we wanted to additionally see and evolve, and we wanted to get some additional commercial experience with the technology. And so we started that process, and then obviously ultimately ended into the structure that we landed on last year. And so what I always say is that it might not be the right answer or the answer that you want to hear, but the answer sometimes is not right now, and here's what you need to work on or focus on. But that doesn't mean it's no forever, right? We'll come back and we'll look at it, we'll evaluate it again. And having that trust, knowing that they're going to work on that, helped us build credibility within Medtronic to say, look, we said this is the things that we wanted them to do. They went and did that. And now let's go and look at this at a much more granular level and provide additional feedback. And so it's a cycle and it's a continuous evolution to get to where we were today.
Something that's come up several times here from companies is like, how does it start? How do we start that initial conversation? I know you just referenced, this has been going on for 6 years, but like, who made the first move? How do you make that first move? Obviously, we're all here to develop relationships, but any advice for companies on that first move?
So until last night, thought I know when this all started, and last night I got corrected that it actually started earlier than what I thought. But for me, it's interesting to get everyone's perspective because I think we all have our own lens. For me, it started when we got that feedback the first time around, from Medtronic, and just add to what Chris said, you can take that feedback and you will hate it. You absolutely will hate it. And, we probably in the first reaction, we're not very nice about Chris. He was in the room, we shared how we felt, but then you have a choice to make, do you believe the feedback you're getting is genuine and you do something about it, or you can say, no, I don't believe that, I want to go the route we want to go. And we, for us, it started, for me, it started at that moment. That was the, I think there's something in there, but we got to go back and we have a lot more work to do until we can get back to that very same moment.
And that was beginning of 2020, right?
That was the beginning of 2020, yes.
And so we'll come to Sabing in a second here. Andrew, when did you guys get involved with this deal, and why? And I will point out that it's great to have Deerfield here at this event, and I'm glad that we're going to grow on this. When did you get involved with CathWorks?
2018. So Chris brought CathWorks to my attention, and there were a number of people in my circle who were existing investors in CathWorks, but I think we were having breakfast, and he mentioned that this was an intriguing opportunity, and I had not really done work on it, and so that piqued my interest. And as I did more and more work, got very excited about the potential of the technology. And Chris and I during that time stayed in close touch, and we decided to co-lead the deal together, the Series C investment together, and so. That was really the moment where we were locked arms in terms of really advancing the company from an equity standpoint, from an investor standpoint. So we led that deal, and we can talk about the ups and downs. There were certainly ups and downs, as there are with most companies, but we worked through it, and we were committed to the company. And as Ramin came in, he really helped spearhead many of the improvements that created a tremendous amount of value, both in the eyes of physicians and shareholders. And that's really what catalyzed what was a very interesting and competitive process when it came to making a deal with Medtronic.
Sabing, when did you get in the story here, and going through diligence with a company like Medtronic is not a small task. So
you'll like the answer to this question because I first got involved at LSI 2020. And so I came to your event February of 2020, I think it was, at the Ritz-Carlton. And so I had a random meeting, and Ramin might tell you that it wasn't so random, but I had a random meeting with CathWorks saying, hey, we might have a need for you to do some second pair of eyes, second opinion on some of what we were doing. And I thought, great meeting, let's see what happens. Got a contact a few weeks later saying, hey, we could really use your help to kind of dig into the technology here. And I think you guys can tell the full story as to what you were already doing at that time in 2020. But we were not the first IP counsel for CathWorks. CathWorks has had patent filings since, 2013, 2012. And so the company, I think, had done fine. But a lot of the technology, as Ramin can tell you, comes out of Israel. And so when you have an Israeli-based company, you don't necessarily have the US counsel as involved and knowing as well as they should what's going on with the technology. And so for us, we were brought in, I think, to help with some particular issues and then also to interact with Medtronic. And what that's interesting, or the interesting part there is that one of the key guys that Chris knows at Medtronic was an associate that I used to work with at Kenobi. And so I know you're going to talk about trust, but I feel like this guy Doug and I already had built some trust together, and so that we knew how he operates, he knows how we operate, and therefore he had some confidence in what we were doing so that when we were explaining the technology, answering the IP questions, dealing with legal issues, we knew what to expect from each other, and I think that really helped with the process, that they could trust what we were telling them and not feel like we were just blowing smoke up them.
let's, Andrew talked about the ups and downs. Let's take a minute to go through some of the ups and downs specific to this deal. So maybe we'll start with Chris. Was there any moment where you thought this deal might not happen, and why, and how did you overcome it? And then maybe others can share their view on that.
Yeah, there was a couple. Obviously, the transition on the IP side, that was a big turning point, I thought. I think the interactions that we were having, we weren't getting confidence in the IP landscape and in the algorithm and what was being explained in terms of the technology and what was actually happening until Kenobi came in and actually helped us understand exactly what was working, and so our guys could understand it. So I think that was a turning point in 2020. I think obviously this transaction that took place last July, I think there was lots of turning points in that. It was a competitive environment. There was an acquisition offer on the table for Kathworks, and we were trying to figure out what is our avenue and our pathway to actually get the transaction, but we were trying to avoid not taking dilution. And so how do we go about doing that? And so we got really creative and kind of worked together and said, here's our problem, here's our issue, we want to do this, can we solve this together? And it goes back to that trust and that transparency to be able to share and talk through different constructs that could work, including partnering with Deerfield for Deerfield to acquire it and then us invest into it that way. And so we looked at a lot of different structures in a very short amount of time. I think both Andrew and I were on vacation with our family, and he was in a much nicer place than I was. But I was sitting in my car while my family was doing things. He was sitting in his room while his family was out, and we were trying to figure out solutions that could work to be able to make it work for the shareholders, for the investors, for the board members, and for Medtronic. So there was lots of ups and downs.
Yeah, so maybe to frame what Chris said from my perspective, so without going into too much detail, we had an outright acquisition offer on the table. So you're getting money today if you sell to this party. And you had Medtronic on the other side saying, we just cannot take this on today given the dilutive impact of the transaction. Now, obviously, the offers were materially different, but certainty versus risk is a very difficult thing for a board member to take on, especially, and for for all shareholders to take on, especially when they were both very attractive offers, right? And so I'll be honest, I was not sure we were going to get there because we were trying everything we could to bridge that gap. So there are a couple ways you can bridge that gap. Well, one is maybe it's not near-term certainty you can solve for, but maybe you can solve for certainty. Venture funds are usually not graded based on IRR. They're graded on the multiple of invested capital. And so for me, I didn't necessarily care if the multiple was lower today, but the IRR was greater. I cared about the magnitude of the multiple. So if we could push the transaction down the road, increase what the return would be relative to the other party, and then get certainty, that's an equation I would take. That's a potential deal. And for Medtronic, I think they were probably, not to put words in your mouth, but you're probably happy to pay that if you know that you don't have to inherit the dilution today, right? So everyone's a little bit uncomfortable, and honestly, I didn't really know if our board was going to get there because, they were both really attractive offers. I think the other element that's really important is everyone recognized that this technology belonged in Medtronic's bag. And, as I mentioned at the outset, a part of this deal is the earnout structure, which, if done incredibly well, can be incredibly valuable. The other party also had elements of earnouts, but I'm not sure that we had the same degree of confidence just given the nature of their business. And so that also kind of weighed in favor of Medtronic. I mean, Chris alluded to the fact that we were doing everything we could with them to try to get this in their hands for many of those reasons. we put on the table a proposal where Deerfield would acquire the company and then Medtronic would pay it down over time. We're pretty creative at Deerfield. We'll come up with these structures at time. Their accountants didn't love it. And then we've ultimately got to what was really that solution for certainty. So it was that put call structure where, you know, at a certain point in time, Medtronic would inherit the company through one of two mechanisms. Either they called it or the company could put it to them, and so we would have effectively solved for that certainty. Yes, a number of years down the road, but again, when you think about how venture investors think about investments, it really is the magnitude of the dollars returned. And so that's ultimately how we got there.
And I think that that certainty in the future, right, was a hard thing for Medtronic to get comfortable with, right? Because if you look, I think we've got 3 or 4 call put structures in all of the transactions that we've done since I've been there, so for 12 years. 3 or 4, right? That's not that many. And so it's a certain profile of a company, of a technology, of a market that we could get comfortable with because CathWorks was already approved in the US, Europe, Japan, had reimbursement, right? Had 850 patients of data. So we were able to get comfortable with that if we pushed it out a few years, right? And so, but that took a lot of convincing internal Medtronic to get people like comfortable to that level.
Yeah, and I mean, there are 2 different important things. One, as you live this, you know, I'm with Andrew, you know, we actually walked into a board meeting and, you know, to make it very easy on me, these deals, when you want to get them done, you know, if you think about the players that you need to have involved, you have your investors, you have the management team, you have a BD, you know, team on the strategic side, and then you have the operating unit, and they all have to go all well together, and they play different roles. There are moments of load that somebody else lifted you up. And right before we walked in, the person who's the president of the coronary division sent me a text and said, let me know if I need to delete your number, you know, today. I'm like, fantastic, you know, this is good to walk into the meeting without any pressure. But it's important as you think about the kind of company you want to run, to think about the people you want to have at the table. You know, one of the benefits of having a Deerfield as an investor is what just Andrew said, because I think probably 9 out of 10 investors, you know, this would be a black and white, you know, transaction. You know, I was, oh, you know, money on the table, and they were pretty meaningful, you know, very different, but very meaningful. I actually flew to Miami to meet with Andrew while we were in the middle of this, because we brainstormed and we struggled, you know, because we were sitting, I think we both had what we thought was a best thing to do, but how do you get there and not convince other people because you want to let them make a decision? So that's one front. The other thing is, it's not done until it's done, but you also don't want to give up. You know, you got to have to stay with it. And there were many, many moments where the easiest thing to do, you know, there were some very late night conversations that I would have with Chris, and then I would call Andrew and say, well, I don't know if I completely pissed him off now. Somebody needs to call him and say, we really want to do the deal. So you got to have to trust that the other person on the other side is giving you what they think. Chris said something, and I don't think this is actually a common thing, because you asked the question of why deals like this don't happen. It takes a level of trust, and I don't know, I think it also takes the group that you're dealing with be committed to the cause, to be open, because, you know, you go in, and if I say one thing to, like, my peers who all want to do this, you know, if you put yourself in the shoes of the BD person of a large company, every day, all they do, they talk to CEOs and investors of a company, and 99% of the time, people come across saying they're perfect, their product is going to change the world. It's actually refreshing if you come and you're vulnerable, you know, it's like, oh, this is the authentic person. We were like that when we made the changes. Medtronic returned that when we were doing this deal, saying, we want to do it, but here's the thing that we need. And I think allow that to go back and have a conversation, and I think DFL played a big role. But a lot of down moments, you know, we had at some point we had a countdown in my office that every day I'm like, it's going to happen eventually, you know. Got to 0, we went over only by a few days.
That's great to hear. And I think from my perspective and from the outside perspective, sometimes the stories about being on vacation and calling each other from your car in your room, or taking the flight out and getting the text, those are the things that we don't hear about that are interesting. And you spend 5, 6, 7 years working on a deal, you're going to go through a lot of those. So are there any other kind of backstories or moments that anybody wants to share? Sabing, I don't know if you had any moments that you want to.
I'm just going to comment on Ramin because I do think having a great chief executive is important, but Ramin is amazing. And so just the amount of time you spent on all aspects. So a lot of times, like I'm an IP attorney, the CEO doesn't know the IP as well as they often should. Ramin knew everything. Like Medtronic has a very, very detailed diligence request. I think one thing that was good in my mind about this deal is because there were starts and stops, you were very well prepared in a way in 2022 when it finally happened because you had done all of the investigations before. There were some things that Medtronic wanted you to correct, which you addressed. But the data room was already essentially complete. So when we came in, we got to supplement and see a lot of the work that was already done. And so a lot of work was put in at the right amount of time so that when you were going a mile a minute in early 2022, when you were on all these calls and we were on calls with you day and night, all kinds of things going on, you had all of that background work already done so that you were probably better prepared for dealing with all those issues.
Yeah, and I think, the important element that you touched on, you got to remember that you try to deal, the larger the company, the more comprehensive the diligence, and, Medtronic is very comprehensive in diligence. But you got to know that each function has a responsibility. They are trying to do what they are tasked to do. So knowing who it is that you need to go back to when you need to, because, if you're dealing with the IP lawyer on the other side, they have a task to do. They're not the one who's going to have to, make the final call, but they need to get very comfortable. I think one of the things that sometimes don't come across is everybody has to get comfortable with the package, the whole thing. And one thing that I learned and appreciated a lot is the role the physician feedback plays in what we do. When you bring a product to the market, we tend to go to the people who are most enthusiastic. But then when you get a feedback you don't like, you usually try to brush over it because you want to find a way to convince yourself. I think one of the things that helped us a lot is we had a pretty good, honest set of feedback even after the improvements. And when we worked with Medtronic, we were actually very transparent on the improvements we made and where we still had gap. Because the anticipation that our management team had is, as soon as they pick up the phone and somebody calls somebody, that's exactly what they're gonna hear. So why not be honest and tell them what it is? And that actually, I think it helped because to Chris's de-risking, you're trying to come up with high certainty, that helped them say, no, we already have anticipated for that risk factor in what we need to do.
Chris, you were going to jump at the other backstory question. Any other?
Yeah, I mean,
any moments?
So I think the investment that we made was in end of 2018, right? So I think basically the whole 2019, we negotiated a co-promotion arrangement, which we couldn't get agreement to because we couldn't align with how our team in Europe was looking at it from a technology and perspective. And so that whole time, even though we made an investment, right, we were like, well, we're not going to get the commercial experience this whole time that we were hoping for as part of our diligence effort, and we couldn't get an agreement with CathWorks on it, right? And it was back and forth fighting, and a lot of discussions back and forth with Ramin's predecessor, and we finally said, look, we're not gonna push forward for that, and then 4 months later, they engaged a bank, started a process to sell, which we participated in, and we didn't put an offer in because of the switch and the kind of the understanding the IP. Right after that, we had another deal that was materially less than what we ultimately agreed to, materially less, but we had to acquire it at that point, right, and take it on ourselves. And we always say, right, we would love to have the product de-risked and wait longer and pay more than to take it on because we're a big company, right? There's a lot of things that play into what we fund, how we fund, what we prioritize. And we were worried that if we brought it into Medtronic, we wouldn't prioritize it and give it the effort that it needed so that it could get to a larger patient population. So there was a lot of back and forth going on there.
Andrew, any backstories?
I mean, so I think it's clear, but maybe to put a point on it. So there were two moments in time separated by 2.5 years where we were deeply engaged with Medtronic. And at one moment in time, we were using a bank. At that second moment in time, we did not. And, I think bankers are fantastic. I think they, with right banker, right situation, can create a tremendous amount of value. In this particular case, the compare and contrast is pretty stark in terms of not just the outcome, it was a materially different offer, but there was a ton of progress made on the technology. But the rapidity and the depth of engagement, I mean, I'd be on the phone with Chris at 10 p.m. at night, and then I'd be calling Ramin, and then Ramin would be calling Jason, and then we would do that every single night to the point that I think at one point, like if you do this, if you call someone enough and you have an iPhone, it'll just make that person your emergency contact. And that's what happened in this case. Thankfully, it's fallen off. You're no longer my emergency contact. But you lose, I think it's not only that trust, you lose that trust when you engage with an intermediary. And if you have those relationships and alignment around the board, it was very easy for Chris to say, hey, would this work? And I'd be like, look, I just don't think that's gonna get it done. Like, I'm not messing with you, I'm not negotiating, I'm telling you, even if I wanted to do it, board's not gonna get that, board is not gonna rubber stamp that. And to be able to reiterate in that way so quickly, to be able to get some of my structuring partners on the phone at like 11 p.m. and talk through different options to deal with accounting issues, like that just doesn't happen unless you have that degree of connection. So to me, it was more of a story of, it's probably a unique situation where you have that depth of engagement, both on the strategic side and the investor side and the CEO side, where we can all work collaboratively to the same goal. And we all felt a little bit uneasy at times, but I think no one felt like we got cheated, right? No one felt like, oh, did I just overpay or did I just take the inferior offer? And for me, it's kind of a perfect outcome in that regard.
So that's this trust idea has come up. Let's talk about that trust element of a deal.
I think for us, it's pretty bottom up because I'm pretty lucky because half of the executive team that we have at CathWorks, I worked with them, for 2 decades in different places. So we wanted to make this thing successful. So this was our goal from the beginning. And we chose to do this thing with understanding of the risks, before there was any deal. So you try to emulate that, and you want to know a group is holding hand. So if you and we chose a more difficult route, but we believe it's the right thing to do. I think if you have investors that sit on your board, it's important to understand what their investment thesis is. So then you can have that conversation. I think a lot of times the mistakes that is made is, the CEOs try to make a deal and then go back and sell it to their board. That's not how it works. I was like, people have to be part of it, and the experience comes in. There were many times when we were doing the deal where Andrew was like, let me just check with somebody because they did something similar, and then it would come back and say he's not going to pass Medtronic accounting, rule. For us was that we believed this was the right thing to do. We actually, I think genuinely everybody believed it was the right thing to do. We were not sure that we could do. I can tell you that, God honest truth, walking into that board meeting, I knew what I wanted to see. I was 100% sure we were going to get there, but we got, there. So it was knowing that you can get there if everybody pulls through, and then you got to kind of take a leap of faith, know that the other people are going to do the same thing.
So there are probably two aspects of trust that I'd want to address. One was the trust between CathWorks and their advisors. And so I feel like in some situations that I see, your patent attorney, your counsel, doesn't necessarily get told all the information that they need to get told. And sometimes it's because the IP counsel is not asking the right questions. And so it's important for the IP counsel to know exactly what's going on to be able to represent the client in the best way possible. And so when Chris, you were talking about some of the technology issues, I did want to address that so that people understand that I think one of the issues involved in this deal is that the counsel didn't understand the technology as well as they needed to. And so while we don't need to get into all the details of the technology, one of my roles is to convince the people at Medtronic as to what the technology is about, why there's risk or there's no risk. But if we can't explain the technology in the right way and answer your questions, you're not going to have trust in the answers that you're being given. And part of that came down to the council needs to understand from the company exactly what's being done. And so we're dealing with technology companies. The technology is very complicated here. And so you can scratch the surface and not really understand the details of it. And in this situation, we really had to get into a lot of the details technically to explain to Medtronic what was important, what's relevant, and to ultimately convince, I think, you guys that what we were telling you was actually not only the truth, but also of manageable risk, let's say.
Yeah, and on that front, right, I was, on my side, I was actually in Europe right before the shutdown on the phone talking with our attorneys saying, you got to understand the technology to a level that we can explain it and they could explain it to us, right? Because they were not talking to each other. They were going over each other prior to Kenobi. And I vividly remember I'm sitting in the lobby of a hotel in Europe, in Germany, doing a diligence trip on another one, talking on our attorneys, trying to get them to figure out how they could actually connect to each other and have the right conversation. And it just was like, well, we're just talking over each other. So that's why we ended up not moving forward at that stage of it. And then obviously they brought in Kenobi based on that discussion and that interaction. And then that helped us get to the comfort level that we needed.
Andrew, you've seen a lot of deals. Anything unique about this on the trust side?
Yeah, yes. I guess it's unique, but it's sort of how you would draw it up, right? You have to, more often than not, there's misalignment with boards and CEOs. There's a different vision for how you want to build the company, how you want to maximize value creating events. And, sometimes you get to an okay place and sometimes you don't. I think in this particular case, we were aligned on exactly what we needed to do to maximize the potential of this technology. And that, I think, unfortunately, is unique. And so in this particular situation, what that does is that gives you just tremendous confidence that there's alignment and that, we're not going to get over our skis when you enter into a process like this that can be very tense and very stressful, and where one slip of the word can potentially result in, an inferior outcome. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it, and this is difficult to manufacture, is, Chris and I have known each other for, a decade plus. And so I have no problem calling him up and being candid. And, when you sort of have alignment with the CEO, the person who's running the process, and you can have that open dialogue with, the potential acquirer, I think that is actually very unique, right? And so to me, it's more, you can't manufacture those situations, but when they happen, I think they can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and the only other kind of trust that I would talk about, right, is one of the aspects that we were contemplating, right, was, like Andrew said, and I think I mentioned, that Deerfield was going to be an acquirer. That's an interesting dynamic, right? Because now he's a competing bid against our bid, right? And so I got a lot of questions in Medtronic, like, can we trust what Deerfield is telling us that that's going to be the case, and they're not trying to just drive up the price against us, right? And I'm like, look, I know Andrew. I've been, a decade with him, talking with him, exploring different companies. We came into this together, into this investment 5 or 6 years ago. You got to trust me that I believe that this is the right thing to do. And if we're trying to solve something, this is a pathway to solve it. It's not complicating it. I mean, it obviously adds a level of complexity, but it's not driving the value in any direction. So there was a trust that we had to have, because now he was bidding, in theory, against us in this process.
So you guys kept each other in check. There wasn't unilateral trust. There was this caution trust. Okay, we're running out of time here. Ramin, I know a lot of folks have come to you and said, hey, how'd you pull the deal off? And you've opened up some of your secret sauce. Was there any final advice you want to give people out there about a deal like this, things you would maybe do differently, or just things to be thinking about?
Well, first, let me thank these guys because, it's not that easy to get the people who play, a key role to come and, as hopefully you saw, openly share, the behind the scenes. But I know that's the thing that we all live through, The CEO job is a very lonely job. I don't have to tell anybody who's here, There are moments where you're there and I am incredibly lucky that I am surrounded by, a CFO I've known for a long time and he keeps me in check, a management team that they all. That is an important element. I believe at the end of the day, when the strategics buy a company, they buy three things. They buy good technology, they buy a market that that technology can fit in, and then they buy a management team. You're basically you're paying for that. So that I think is what's going to take to be able to do what you need to do, to be surrounded by people that you're comfortable challenging you every day. And that is, vulnerability is actually a good leadership, skills. But surrounding by a group of people that they are comfortable to come to you and they don't feel like they have to agree with you. God, I can't even get them to agree to me on anything. So, that helped a lot. I've had these conversations many, many times, actually just in the past 2 days. People ask, when you get investors added to your company, you're not just asking for money. You're trying to bring somebody to the table that can give you strategic insight. And that means that they're not going to agree with you also, but it's good. They're going to keep you in check. And then the last thing is, and I have had the luxury of sitting on the other side, being, responsible for a business doing BD deals. You got to see it from the perspective of the other party. It takes a BD team, it takes an operating unit to be able to do a deal with a strategic. When we entered into this one, I think a lot of people said it's impossible because call and put doesn't happen. It might be a different kind of valuation. But if you get those things, then, timing is the other part. So even if you go through it, sometimes it may not work out, stick with it. I think it'll work out.
Thank you. Well, we learned complex deals take time, they take trust, and I want to thank all sides of the table for joining us today. We didn't get to any questions, but if you have any, please come up afterwards. And I want to thank all of the panelists. Ramin, congratulations. LSI alumni #1, right? 2020, here we are with this deal, and very proud, and it's great to be here. Thank you, everyone.